and continue to be. Whether the unrest is because of race or because of politics or because racially informed politics. This morning, what I would like to do is share with you briefly a history of race within the church, and I'm thinking particularly the Episcopal Church. And so you're going to find a handy slideshow I'm going to present to you. There's a book called Episcopalians and Race. It was written by Gardner Shattuck, and it goes basically through 1990, and then I'm going to play catch up with us at the end a little bit and say what's happened since that time. The first thing that I think is helpful before I start this is just a reminder, if you have questions, please put them in chat or do a lot of waving so I can see you. I'm really happy to pause because the goal is to make sure that we're really on the same page here and understand a little bit of the church history. And I'll talk about some other traditions as well at the end, but also our Episcopalian interaction with race, especially through the last about 150 years. Also, I want you to know about the church, the way the church is set up. It's really important to hear. And I'm going to share an affirmation first. One of the reasons I knew I could join the Episcopal Church was that I went to General Convention in 2009 when it was in Los Angeles. So every 3 years, the Episcopal Church, which spans 18 different countries, although most members are in the United States, but countries like Taiwan and Haiti come together for the largest democratic gathering on the planet. Now that may sound strange, but the number of delegates at General Convention exceeds any other convention in the world. And that convention, it's called the triennial, it used to be the biennial, but it's a triennial, has 3 different houses. There's the lay house, there's the clergy, and then there's the House of Bishops. So you can already hear there's the House of Commons and the House of Lords. We got that idea from England. Because debate can be very contentious, we decided quite some time ago that when having a debate on any issue, anybody can speak, provided that they pre-register for a slot. And when it's your turn, the microphone is on for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, it's off. I have to tell you, this is part of why I'm an Episcopalian. Because I went to the General Convention in 2009 in which they were discussing whether openly gay people could be clergy. And I heard because there's only 2 minutes, there was no time for name calling. You had to make your point and stop. Not only was there no name calling, there was real gentleness and urgency to move together. And not just move together in America, but to move with the rest of the Anglican communion in the world. And I'd never seen such a well-grounded way of discussing divisive issues. So I love the 2-minute rule. I do. I wish our presidential debates had it, but that's, I don't need to say that. Microphone off, microphone on. That's great. And at the Triennial Convention is when the national canons are set. And what a lot of people don't know is that we really are a federalist system in a lot of ways, so that there are national canons and then there are individual diocesan canons. And sometimes an individual diocese can resist the national canons. I'll just give you an example. We decided in 2015 that same-sex marriage was a sacrament in the church. That was decided in the national canons. However, each bishop in her or his diocese is able to exert control, especially over sacraments, which meant, it no longer means this because we've changed the national canons, it meant for at least 3 years that if, let's say, Andy Doyle said same-sex marriage will not be performed in my diocese, it would not be. So I want you to hear strong states' rights made it into the government of the Episcopal Church. That's changed a little bit because now there is a trial for the Bishop of Upper New York, an ecclesiastical court, because that person has forbidden same-sex marriage in their diocese. Nobody is defrocked in the Episcopal Church. I can never be defrocked as a priest. My bishop can never take my ordination away. not just because he didn't ordain me, but we believe that there is a sacramental change at ordination. I can be inhibited, which means my bishop can say, you may not serve sacraments in my diocese anymore, but I cannot be defrocked. I cannot be unpriested, which is why part of the ordination is you're a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So I'm giving you this up front because we're going to talk today about some general conventions and the way they handled race issues, okay? So part of that is understanding the structure and how it is that the General Convention can say one thing and individual diocesan bishops can say another. Another important thing to say is that each diocese has one bishop that's called the diocesan. A lot of people don't realize this. The diocesan bishop is the diocese. That means when Andy Doyle goes to Taiwan, the Diocese of Texas just went to Taiwan. Our diocese has 2 suffragan bishops and an assisting bishop. A suffragan bishop is somebody who has a vote in the House of Bishops, but is not the diocesan bishop. So if there's ever a dispute between a suffragan and a diocesan, there's actually not a dispute. The diocesan is the diocese. It's really important to hear. So early on, there were some black suffragan bishops, but they were not diocesan, and that matters. Okay, that meant they didn't have the ultimate authority in the diocese. Curiously enough, there were some black suffragan bishops who weren't allowed to vote. It's really curious because the word suffragan means you can vote. This is all part of our history. What I want to start with actually is, and I'm just going to give you a chapter by chapter, which roughly corresponds to some overarching epochs in our church history. So going way, way back to the Civil War. I'm not going back to the very, very beginning, although I can do that a little bit. You know, the first Episcopal priest who was black is Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, and they were free black people in New York. And essentially what was happening is that the communion rail was segregated, as was the congregation. That is, if you were black and you wanted to work and you wanted to worship in an Episcopal church, you had to either sit in the balcony or you had to wait until white folks had communion and then you could have it. Sometimes if there wasn't enough seating, you didn't get to come in. And so Richard Allen, not Absalom Jones, but Richard Allen ended up saying, look, we're not going to be second-class citizens on earth and in heaven. So we're going to have our own church. And that's where the African Methodist Episcopal Church came from. You hear those 2 words, Methodist, Episcopal. It's helpful to remember John Wesley was an Anglican priest until he died. The Methodist Church came after Wesley, but early on, very strong union between the 2, and of course, African. And that really was a church, and still exists today. There's a historically black denomination. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1862, honestly, a lot of black Episcopalians or AME members or Methodists, black Christians, actually thought it was apocalyptic. Like this was a new creation. So either the world was going to end, or this was like a radical orientation of life. And so what happened after that was a lot of paternalism. And we can find this even as well in abolitionists, that white Christians, white abolitionists were in charge of the emancipation movement because we didn't think black people could do that. And so home missions actually had this paternal emphasis of being a civilizing arm. So white bishops oversaw these home missions or these missionary districts that were targeted at the phrase colored people or people of color at the time. These colored districts in regular dioceses, they didn't have votes, and if they had suffragan representation in the House of Bishops, those people couldn't vote. Again, that's really strange. A diocese actually has to pay the national church in order to have suffragan representation. So it's a privilege to have extra bishops And in order to have them be able to vote at the House of Bishops, you have to support the House of Bishops in an extra measure. So this was happening, and yet those people couldn't vote. And one of the sort of most heinous case studies, although it's changed quite a bit, I mean, the transformation really has happened in the last 50 years. Maybe you've heard of Sewanee, the University of the South. And Sewanee was founded right before the Civil War. And it was supposed to be, cultivate the ideal white Southern gentleman. And so it really was founded with some intentionality to represent Anglo-Saxons. For the longest time, they displayed Confederate flags. I'm talking about after the war, obviously, well into the 1900s. Black people were only allowed in the dining room as servers. And in the 50s, and we'll see more about how this is endemic, just to give you an idea of where the church history is going, the trustees, under pressure, really pushed to integrate the University of the South. Most of the faculty resigned because they were theologically opposed or culturally opposed, I don't know how you choose to say that, to having an integrated institution for education, an integrated seminary. The students were ahead of their teachers. So 80% of the students stayed and weathered that transition. There were some major problems, like the restaurant was privately owned, but it was on the campus. And so they made a rule, you can't have a segregated restaurant on campus anymore. Ultimately, what happened is the restaurant moved off campus so that it could continue to be segregated. Now, when you go to seminary in order to be ordained, a bishop is able to tell you which seminary you shall go to if you'd like to be ordained. Some bishops say, here are your 2 or 3 choices. Sometimes the diocese will support you going to seminary as a priest, like will give you economic or financial support. Sometimes they won't and say, hey, you're on your own dime and I get that, but you're going to go to Virginia. That can happen. When Sewanee made the flip in the 50s, some bishops ordered their people to transfer. So regardless of what the seminarians wanted, a bishop could have required them to transfer, whereas other bishops who were pro-desegregation ordered their students to stay, even if the students didn't want to be there. So it was a really sticky period in Sewanee's history. The first Black seminarian to be given a degree was a man called James Pike, and he flagrantly refused what he called a degree in white divinity. So here was a Black man who'd done his coursework, who was headed towards ordination to the priesthood, and he walked away from this quote-unquote honorary degree because he found it actually insulting. Now, it may be helpful for you to know that the number of seminaries has dialed down, and Sewanee is a case study because it's the one in the South. The other Southern seminaries, there used to be one in Lexington, Kentucky, that's now closed. There's one in Austin called Seminary of the Southwest. There's one in Chicago that's mostly done called Bexley Hall. There's one at Yale that's combines with Yale School of Divinity. There's General in New York. There's Nashotah House in Minnesota. That's where Craig Morgan went. Jenny, of course, did her master's degree at Sewanee, and there's one in San Francisco. And based on the demographics I've just told you, it's clear to see why Sewanee is the case study. National trends saw the Jim Crow church, and I think that's right to say, have to change. And basically, as you know, there was a great migration in this country, particularly as jobs opened up in Detroit. A lot of, oh, I'm sorry, Antha, thanks. Seminary in Virginia, Virginia Theological Seminary. I left that one out, and it's the biggest one. I'm sorry about that. In case you're wondering, I went to Emory University, which is a Methodist school, but they have an Anglican Studies program, so we kind of halfway count. Even though there's only one other priest in the Diocese of Texas that went there. Okay, there was a great migration, and what that meant is the Black Episcopalian population, which was already not huge, went north. So the Episcopal Church, comprised of Black people in the South, was less than 1% of Black people were Episcopalians after that great migration. The income gap was incredible. So when you hear today that a Black man makes 90% of a white man with similar credentials, you want to think that if you were a priest of color, you made more like 20%. There were almost no diocesan resources aimed at helping priests of color receive a training. And that didn't matter whether you were Black or Latinx or Native American. They didn't sponsor seminarians. There was no national support. So the General Convention, and we pay every year a diocesan fair share. If you look at our budget, and that just came out in the mail, you'll see a portion that is given, I think it was $66,000 this year. We give that to outreach. A lot of that outreach, I will tell you, is factored into the diocese. So we pay a share to the diocese that supports the bishop and the bishop staff and diocesan initiatives. And then there's another part that goes to the national church as well. And that supports obviously the presiding bishop staff, and presiding bishop and the General Convention initiatives, right? So there were no General Convention initiatives giving any support to Black seminarians. So what happened is, even though this transition was happening demographically, there was no step up, and there was really no support or frankly much care for Black seminarians or historically Black parishes. In the North, things started to happen first, like integrated Eucharists. In fact, you'll see this in a couple of slides. The Bishop of Alabama argued that in Christ, the Eucharist can be separate but equal. You just have to hear that. That was in the 1960s. And he made that argument on an obscure New Testament passage, totally taken out of context, which is heartbreaking. The North also not only integrated Eucharist, but had integrated seating in church. That was new. Potluck dinners could be integrated. That was novel. They started rigorous training for Black clergy, although it still wasn't quite as supported. So you'll hear about this in a little bit. What's right down here after World War II, that's really what pushed the Jim Crow laws throughout the country and the Jim Crow practices forward. And the reason that happened, of course, is that we drafted Black service people. And they sometimes segregated, sometimes not in their service with white conscripts. So when they came back, having risked their lives, they demanded, frankly, that they get the benefits of that. And one of these that you'll see here is that there was a all-Black divinity school in Virginia, adjacent to Virginia Theological Seminary, and it was absolutely dilapidated. So if you've ever driven by Mom Alone restaurant here on Nassau Road 1, I only pick on them because it's easy to do. Their seminary looked like that. Next to Virginia Seminary, which is in fact, after Trinity Wall Street, the single wealthiest institution in the Episcopal Church. So there was going to be a capital campaign to help basically plug the leaks in the roof for the Bishop Payne Divinity School. And because of World War II, they thought, well, we just need to integrate Virginia. And that was a big deal because, as many of you know, Virginia was not the national leader in emancipation. In fact, if you go to Trinity Galveston, you'll see things that you will see if you go to Virginia, which is in the middle of Pew. There's a little bar. It's not little, it's actually pretty big. In case you're wondering, that bar is because slave owners did not want to sit in the same pew with their slaves, so they put a bar there to show some separation between their attending maids and servants. That is still there at Trinity Galveston. And Charlie Bolden tells me that in Washington, D.C., you can find similar bars still there in historic churches. Have a look here as well that in Virginia, it was not until 1946 that Black Episcopalians at convention, every year we have to have a convention for the diocese. Black representation used to be you could have 2 Black people, and until in the 1946 they decided to be liberal and make representation proportional, and that was new. Have a look that in 1954 South Carolina sent its very first Black delegates, and they were not proportional to national convention. That's 1954. In 1947 even, have a look that the General Convention itself was segregated, and the idea of changing that was openly mocked from the floor. General Convention was not integrated until 1952. And of course, as you know, there's a difference between a rule that integrates and the way people are treated. One of the big pushes after World War II, as you see, was desegregation. But part of the way that happened is that a lot of historically Black colleges, historically Black seminaries were pressured to close and to merge. And of course, all of the research that I'm familiar with and the voices of the time were, we don't want those to close. We would like to have a place where we can actually be safe and heal and process. And that just wasn't on the agenda. The agenda was to go ahead and push forward toward integration and to do it immediately. And again, that didn't give space really for healing and exploration. Imagine being a Black student at Sewanee in the 50s, when the year before, the only way you were allowed on campus is serving in the dining room. Most of the faculty resigned over your being there. Imagine what a rough start to your theological education that's going to be. Same thing with historically Black parishes. You'll see that in a minute. There was a lot of pressure for those to close and to merge with historically white parishes so that there could be this integration. And of course, what ended up happening when that happened was that if you were a Black clergy person, you just lost your job because the historically white parish was going to hire a white minister, whether Black people went there or not. That was the early trend in the desegregation movement in the church. Of course, many of you know about Brown versus the Board of Education, and there was a district court judge, J. Waits Waring. He's an interesting case study because he actually grew up a Southern gentleman in South Carolina, but he had an epiphany, and really is what helped at the District Court of Appeals push forward desegregation. Thurgood Marshall, many of you may not know this, an Episcopalian. I mean, his legacy is pretty secure, right? But part of what he did with J. Waits Waring, again, at the federal court level, was not only desegregate busing, but they both openly chided the white church for being overtly racist and took them to task theologically for not following the gospel. Most of you know, and we saw this in a video this week, I'm trying to remember the name of that video clip that we watched. It's called A Girl Like Me. It's a recent clip of children being offered dolls that are Black or white. They're Black children. They all pick the white doll as better. They pick the Black doll as worse. And then when asked, what does that say about you? They say, I'm not as good as a white person. I mean, they're children saying that stuff, right? And many of you know in the history of the Brown versus Board of Education, that psychological study was extremely influential in turning over the idea that separate could be equal. Same time, there was an attorney named Murray who put together a catalog of all the racial laws he could muster. Obviously, this was his idea, but he didn't do all the work. The racial laws in each state. And it was a thick volume in order to bring attention to something that people thought wasn't that significant. When Brown was decided by the Supreme Court, it was publicly affirmed by most denominations. And part of the way we did that was by moving General Convention from Houston, which was still segregated, to Honolulu at the request of Black bishops. Now, there was a huge uproar, not only because there had been some planning already, but because the largest democratic gathering in the world not only requires planning, but has economics as well. And, well, people wanted to have it in Houston. South Carolina was really vocal. It's really easy to call South Carolina out. I'm sorry about that. But they opposed the desegregation of churches, and they publicly opposed the Brown versus Board of Education. There was a journalist, a white lady named Ann Braden in Louisville in 1954, who after Brown, she was super well respected, by the way. I think she was on the short list to win the Pulitzer Prize. And she bought a home in a historically white neighborhood for a Black couple and gave them the deed, right? So her goal was to break the color barrier. And she ended up going on trial for being a communist over that. And it sort of ended her career. So she absolutely was blackballed for that. In Montgomery, Alabama, clergy were dismissed, frankly, for affirming the Brown versus Board of Education decision, for not requiring the Black parishioners wait until white folks were done, for integrating the rail. They were dismissed. Now, they weren't defrocked, but they were dismissed, which meant they lost their job. And there was no discussion of that at General Convention that year, which is why General Convention was called Pontius Pilate. There was established in 1954 a biracial commission, and it emphasized full access to communion, to sacraments instead of integration, but it sort of really lost its ability to focus on racial healing in the South, because the insistence was, hey, look, there's more people of color than just Black people, so we really should focus on all minorities. And with such a broad focus, it really wasn't able to function. Funding was really limited, and there was really no specific things they were able to do. Okay, as you know, there was beginning to rise quite a bit of social activism in the late 1950s. The suburbs were pretty lethargic. Part of that, many of you know, is because the GI Bill enabled white servicemen special access to buy homes that Black servicemen were not provided. And so the creation of the suburbs in the 50s really favored frankly, racial division. So I mentioned to you that historically Black parishes were pushed to close, that Black Episcopalians declined by at least 10%, but so did overall Episcopal membership. And depended who was assigning blame why that happened. It was either because the clergy were too divisive, or the clergy were too slow to come out on the side of social justice, or because the parishes were segregated, or because they were forced to desegregate. So there was quite a bit of uproar. And by the way, that's not unique to the Episcopal Church, but that's really what we're talking about this morning. Probably the biggest legacy in the church that happened in 1959 was the founding of something called the Episcopal Society for Cultural and Racial Unity. That's ESCRU. It was a parachurch organization. It did have not only freedom, but some funding at the national level, and they organized things like sit-ins in churches or kneel-ins where Black people would come to the rail before their appointed time and refuse to get up until they were served. Interesting to think about having to have a kneel-in at a church, isn't it? They went places like St. Augustine in Florida, which was historically a white community, and they had wade-ins at the beach where they would get into the ocean and refuse to leave until police pulled them out. Of course, ESCRU was absolutely opposed by Southern leaders as being disobedient to the law, and those people were called chaplains to the Confederacy. They might have pushed too hard too fast, This is what people say, because in 1961, they started advocating for interracial marriage and the right for that to happen. Remember, that was illegal in many states. And it was particularly concerned because they had just desegregated an Episcopal teen retreat center. And so it was viewed as encouraging teenagers to not only have interracial relationships. It wasn't just like they were trying to fight for the right, they were encouraging it. And so there was a huge backlash. Remember, this is the early 60s. What happened in the civil rights crisis? Well, you know about freedom riders. They didn't get discussed at the General Convention. Escrew ended up leading a prayer pilgrimage bus tour, and they did that not just to states like Mississippi, they did it to historically segregated parishes and Episcopal schools. And of course, they were called agitators, and many Southern bishops especially said that what they were doing was wrong. They were supposed to mediate, not agitate. And out of that first pilgrimage bus tour, 13 of the riders were put in prison. And many bishops, of course, endorsed that. The second bus got sent to Sewanee. And there were sit-ins at that restaurant I mentioned, which essentially just moved off campus so that they could do whatever they wanted. Here's this interesting phrase from the Southern bishop. Jesus allowed Gentiles to be different. They didn't have to be circumcised to be included in the church. And therefore, access to Jesus was separate, but equal. So that was how bishops justified segregation, or one way, anyway. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is important because many of you may know this, that Atlanta is 60% Black, or has been that high, openly put out that too many parishes are gymnasiums where we exercise by reading the Book of Common Prayer, neither sweating nor breathing hard. It's an interesting religious critique. In Alabama, this is where it really starts to turn sort of ugly. A Black priest marched for rights, and a white priest, whom I happen to know, showed some support for Escrew. And both of them were either removed. Now, reminder, the way a removal works is that parishes are places that pay their own bills and pay the diocese a fair share. We're a parish. We have a rector. That's me. I come in with tenure. I cannot be removed by the bishop. I can be inhibited, no longer allowed to serve sacraments if I do something really bad, like steal money or have an affair. I can be really lazy. I can be really lousy. A bishop cannot remove me for laziness or lousiness unless I do something criminal or immoral. On the other hand, there's churches that don't pay all their own bills, or they don't pay the diocese. They pay their bills, but they don't pay the diocese. Those places are called missions, and they have vicars. And a bishop can pull a vicar like that. So this Black priest was a vicar, and he got yanked. The white priest, it's really interesting how that ended up working out. The white priest was the Reverend Edward Harrison. Now, my mentoring rector was the Reverend Edward Harrison, and that was his father, who was at the Cardinal Parish in Mobile. And because of his support for Escrew, he was declared public enemy #1 by the White Citizens Council. They burned an effigy of him at their meeting. And what do you know? He left Mobile. But this was a pretty well-known priest, Edward Harrison. And as I mentioned to you, this was the father of my mentoring rector. Probably the turning point in the South was George Wallace, who, as many of you know, ran under the Dixiecrat ticket. What's really interesting is George Wallace probably was not actually an active racist. He was what we would call a strategic racist. Most of his political career, he was pretty moderate. When he failed to win his gubernatorial bid in Alabama twice, he realized strategically that if he emphasized segregation, he might have a better chance of winning. So he did. And even when he ran against Nixon in 72 as a Dixiecrat candidate, he took 14% of the popular vote. So probably George Wallace saying that segregation was the right thing, not only yesterday, but today and forever, really pushed some bishops to be more moderate. Although, again, the response was that Jesus changed slavery personally and not through a mass appeal. So he did it one-to-one, not in policy. That was sort of the excuse for not moving faster, and that, of course, race was not the only issue for the church. Because I lived in Atlanta, I know this all too well. There is in Atlanta probably the best 2 private schools that cost $30,000 a year each are the Woodruff School, which is not Episcopalian, and the Lovett School, it used to be. The Lovett School is really a fine school, but General Convention decided that all Episcopal institutions had to desegregate. Bishop of Atlanta told the Lovett School to remove their Episcopal affiliation so they could continue to deny Black students admission. The bishop told them to leave the Episcopal Church so they could have racist admission policies, and they did. It's crazy to think about, by the way, absolutely crazy. I mentioned St. Augustine to you as well. 64 was a really strong General Convention. It was in St. Louis, in which Barry Goldwater was really called out, frankly, for running a racist campaign, but that had to be softened because Barry was an Episcopalian. Speakers publicly put out that religion had replaced Christ, and this is really what happened, is that the clergy moved ahead of the lay people. So clergy started marching. Clergy were celebrating interracial marriage. Clergy were telling people that they did not have to obey unjust laws, and clergy were ahead of their parishioners and ahead of their bishops. It's probably because they were younger. They had just come out of I mean, there's a lot of reasons you can think through that. But that's really when the clergy got out front. And by the way, I'll tell you, the clergy probably got in front of the laity in our same-sex marriage decisions too in the church as well. And this is really a turning point in the Episcopal Church, where the clergy became more socially active than your average parishioner. 64 is when all Black institutional subsidies ended. There's some really ugly things that happened. Real big question, do we approach by theology and education, or do we approach on justice with activism? Of course, the answer is it doesn't have to be an either or, but that's what the convention was divided on. There was an accusation that Southern bishops were being supplanted by Northern workers, and that was theologically without precedent and shouldn't be happening. Right before the March to Selma, there was a kneel-in, and the bishop said, "Get the hell out of my church. You're not allowed to do that." You're not allowed to have a integrated kneel-in my church. And it became a really big question. Were clergy allowed to vest for their protests? It was okay for them to go march. Were they allowed to wear their clerical collars? And bishops, curiously enough, are still allowed to make insinuations like that. If I broke it, I'd have to go to a trial, not before the bishop, but I think before a committee, because there is something in the clergy manual that says I'm not allowed to engage in conduct unbefitting a clergy person. I don't know what that means to you, but it seems like that could mean a whole lot of things. Turns out that the presiding bishop was the tiebreaker that year. And the presiding bishop, who actually had come out of Texas, that was Bishop Hines, was the one who said, no, we are absolutely integrating. Jonathan Daniels publicly went up against the Alabama Bishop Carpenter and complained that Blacks were forced to sit in the back, that Blacks were required to have communion second. And the bishop said that's to teach them humility. which is a Christian virtue. And Daniel said, that's humiliating. He ended up being killed by white racists for breaking a color barrier in a store. He dared to walk in a white store and was killed. And Carpenter's response were that activists are as bad as racists because they both break the law. And when you break the law, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. That was 1964. That's a bishop in the Episcopal Church. When the black bishop was refused entry to the Selma Church, they took Eucharist in the street. And not only did schools like the Lovett School lose their Episcopal affiliation so that they could stay segregated, but some churches did that too, and they became independent. Of course, they didn't get to keep their building, but that wasn't as important to them as being able to keep their policies. Okay. Obviously, Black power was a big problem in the 70s. The National Church had 2 Black employees, so hardly representative. As I mentioned to you, Black priests had very little opportunities for employment because they were majority white parishes. That's still true today. If you're a Black priest in the Episcopal Church, you have much less hope of being hired, I'm going to be honest with you, and the jobs that you have to look at historically Black churches are just going to pay less, because they tend to be in lower income places than white parishes. So there still is, in some ways, like, I wouldn't say a color barrier, but colored speed bumps in the Episcopal Church. A lot of what happened then is that there was essentially a brain drain. There was no Black representation on the Episcopal Urban Planning Committee. Most of the S crew, and this is like the liberal arm of the Racial Integration Initiative, they were white people. So again, it was paternalism. General Convention really took a turn here when Bishop Hines in 1967 toured Harlem and pushed a quarter of the national budget to alleviate poverty in cities without any religious strings attached. So a quarter of what we were sending to the National Convention was going to places like Watts and Newark and Philly, and for good reason. There were incredible riots going on, right? Detroit as well followed right after 67. The goal of that money at General Convention was so there could be stability for society. There was actual liberal political zeal going on. People were apprehensive, is the church even relevant? I mean, there's riots in the city, and what's the church doing about that? And so these initiatives ended up passing. What's really weird is that they passed through this General Convention special program that hired secular administrators that were absolutely disinterested in the theological reasons to do things. And so it sort of operated like your regular old nonprofit. And that alienated clergy and lay people alike. At the end of the day, the Red Cross is a better nonprofit than the Episcopal Church is. The difference between us, right, is that we're not just a nonprofit. We have things like theology of hope and emphasis on reconciliation of the gospel, and other nonprofits don't have that. I mean, we really are different, I think. S crew started to split. What should we do? White people should root out racism while helping Black people build their own sense of power and pride, was kind of where that came down. Polly asked me if integration was an issue in Europe or just an issue in America. And I just want to go ahead and say integration is still a major problem in Europe. And that's because for a long time, they didn't have any kind of diversity. I mean, we have to be honest. But I will tell you, when I lived in Germany, which is not that long ago, there was a major problem with the influx of Turkish immigrants. And you can see this on the news. There's all kinds of ghetto districts of African refugees in Paris. And so the way, of course, people are trying to deal with that is banning burqas. Which is a strange response. And so I'll tell you, in terms of race, and sometimes we may feel like we're behind the rest of the world, but we have diversity the rest of the world doesn't have. I believe that's the case. And so the rest of the world is looking to us, and hopefully we'll figure out something to guide them. But they're making the same kinds of mistakes in places like Germany and France. I mean, Finland maybe is a model society, but it has like 100,000 people live there. I mean, so it's just important to remember the scale that we have, and that it's really, really hard. And beyond that, other countries don't quite have the legacy of specific African slavery that we have here. Okay, in 1969, there was a group that walked into the General Convention and demanded $500 million in reparations from the Episcopal Church from Christian exploitation of blacks. And there was extreme division among the laity. What's interesting is that group got $200,000. The Time magazine published that as the church paying reparations. And that word is really tumultuous. And I'll tell you, and if you didn't know that, it is. Most people don't use that word now. Instead, they use the phrase repairing the breach, which comes out of the scripture in Isaiah, that the Lord doesn't want to just go back to the way things are. The Lord will repair the breach. More about how Andy Doyle is doing that now. That convention was really fraught, and that's probably when the 2-minute rule got instituted. I don't know this specifically, but there were all kinds of interruptions in that general convention. People were walking out. There were anti-war demonstrations. As I mentioned, there was the Black Manifesto group. People were trying to do what they could. So they added specifically Black youth and Black adults to the executive council, whether that was proportionate or not. Major move to strengthen Black colleges. I don't want to read the slides to you, of course. There was funding for the Malcolm X Liberation University. I mean, all of this was extremely divisive because Malcolm X was divisive, but it happened. And there was funding for a Black awareness coordinator at a school in which a Black power group took over the administrative building by force. And so all of this was really, really, really tough. And it resulted in a lot of walkouts. It resulted in a lot of people, quite honestly, saying, you can do whatever you want, a general convention, in my diocese, this is how we're going to do it. Or I don't care what the diocese is doing, this is what we do in my church. And there's a little room to negotiate that. According to the national canons, gay marriage is a sacrament in the Episcopal Church, but there's some parishes that haven't heard of that yet. They've decided that not in my church. And that's a really interesting conundrum, isn't it? The canons of the national church say one thing, and you're going to act like that's not a thing, or you're going to leave. And this is really hard, and that's just not new. What I'm trying to say, that goes way back here to the civil rights era. Some of the teeth got taken out when we had the convention in Houston. Diocesan bishops could veto line items of national spending. S-Crew ended up getting disbanded. And of course, as you know, church attendance in mainline denominations continues to fall, nationwide continues. When Hines retired in '74, Mississippi Bishop John Allen was chosen and is trying to reorient the church. And there's a few other things just to highlight to you. Catherine Jeffrey Shorey was consecrated the presiding bishop about 15 years ago. Of course, she was the first female presiding bishop in the Episcopal Church. She was a biologist by training. If you know anything about her, she's a real interesting lady. I have friends who were in church networks who told me how that election went. And it's not a great story. They said that conservatives were not pushing for her initially, but there came a point where they were so frustrated with the quote unquote liberal general convention that conservative people pushed her election, even though they didn't believe in her, as a way to show she was going to fail. So they wanted her elected so that there could be a failure, which is appalling. I just want you to hear this, right? This is in the last 20 years, not even 50 years ago. Of course, I think a different story is where she ended up taking us so that Michael Curry was elected on the first ballot, the first Black presiding bishop in the Episcopal Church. and it wasn't that kind of controversial election or elect a straw man that happened with Catherine Jeffrey Shorey. In Diocese of Texas in 2020, Bishop Doyle announced that he has leveraged diocesan funds with the support of the Executive Council to do some repairing of the breach. And I think it's something like $8 million is being invested in historically Black colleges, supporting Black scholarships for school and for seminary. And what Bishop Doyle tells us really interesting is that Christ Church Cathedral was built with slaves, and that many of the endowments in the Diocese of Texas, which function really well and allow the diocese to do a lot of, frankly, creative and important programming, were so strong because of slavery. And so the word he used is repairing the breach. And maybe other people are doing it. I'm just most familiar with it here. And I was at council and I saw a few people whom I happen to know and respect and actually love very deeply be very moved by this announcement to the point they needed to leave the room. And so that's where we're headed, is trying to figure this out. Maybe I should tell you just a little bit about race in the church. Many of you know, many of you don't know. There used to be one mainstream Baptist church in the United States, one very big main line. Now there's more than 100 mainline Baptist denominations. The biggest split happened in 1845 between the Northern Baptists and the Southern Baptists, and the bone of contention was whether or not one could keep slaves. And the Southern Baptist Convention were the ones who pushed, obviously, for slave ownership. And that was why they split. The Southern Baptist Convention continues to be the largest owner of missionary capital in the world. Obviously, they've reversed their official position on that since then, but that was where Southern Baptists came from. The other thing to mention to you is you may know about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly referred to as the Mormon Church. Previously believed that Black people were Black because of their sin. That was why their skin was dark, because they were inherently sinful. That position got reversed in 1979 when their chief elder had a vision that that wasn't the case, or at least not anymore. Some people have come to us from the Methodist Church, and the Methodist Church has their own fraught history like we do with all, I mean, nobody's on the right side of everything. And their ambivalence has mirrored our own, honestly. What about the Catholic Church? Well, the last time we had a Black Pope was in 496, and most people don't even think of popes as Black, but St. Augustine of Hippo was a Black man. So you'll often see him as this white guy, and he wasn't. That's how we revise things. I mean, he was African. From 496, the next time there was a Black cardinal was 1960, and that was a cardinal in Africa. So consider that the cardinals in Africa were all white men until 1960. So by no means are we alone as a church in our ambivalence and our need to move forward here. And it's just a really tough history. We're still trying to figure out, there are some really strong thinkers that you'll read, and I think it's helpful to name this today. People who are developing what's called Black theology. One of the strongest and most influential male thinkers is called James Cone. He was at Union Theological Seminary, and he made the argument that Jesus was a Black man with a capital B. That is, he was at the bottom of the social hierarchy and had the least rights as a day laborer, which meant he and the modern day equivalent would have been Black. He wasn't saying Jesus had Black skin. He was saying Jesus represented that low status of being Black. You can read about that in a book called God of the Oppressed. James Cone argued with liberation theology Gustavo Gutierrez that says that God is on the side of the oppressed. The strongest probably Black theologian female Dolores Williams came up with the term womanist. A womanist is a Black feminist, and being Black is very important as opposed to just being a feminist, because the Black woman experience is very different from the white woman's experience. She does some real radical, some really radical theology, in which she sort of says that the Black woman's experience in the church has been that of the mammy, and that women have been forced to endure suffering, but nobody like the Black woman. And she questions a theology that glorifies suffering or validates suffering in any way. So she says, hey, we're not going to say anything positive comes out of suffering, whether it's the cross or anything else, because that's an endorsement of suffering. And where that's womanist theology, just in a quick bit. Dolores Williams is the womanist theologian. You've heard me mention this before. We're still struggling because most religious metaphors are couched in phrases of light is good and white is clean and black is sullied and dirty and dark. And boy, it's really hard to have those kind of terms and that way of thinking and then look at people's skin color and not have some kind of subconscious reaction to who's better and who's worse. So colorism exists in the liturgy, period. And we're still trying to figure out, how do we do that? As many of you know, St. Thomas is a great community, and we have 3 Black members. And sometimes we scratch our head, how do we be more open and inviting? And listen, we're open and inviting people, and the segregation of churches is really old. It used to be forced. And how we do that, I think, starts internally. But I got to tell you, I don't always like to be the one white man in the room. And there's a lot to be said for that. And to be the one Black person in a church means people often ask you, what do Black people think? Which is not a question most people want to answer as tokens. So these are threads we still have to figure out. The first female Black bishop, she was a suffragan, was consecrated in 1998. The first female Black diocesan bishop, 2017. So this is new. And it's ugly. And that's my presentation on the Episcopal Church. And I'm hopeful that we're moving forward. I think what we're trying to do is get the thought structures right. And I think the other thing we're trying to do is say, in what ways can we participate in the mending of the world and the repairing of the breach? But as you know, in some ways, you can personally repent from the sins of racism, and the question is really whether or not that makes a difference to the social structures that hold people as second-class citizens because of racism. So regardless of our personal feelings and the purity of them, the question is, what are we doing to mend the world? And I think that's the push the Episcopal Church is now asking us to do. Maybe some of you have questions or comments or concerns.
Mike?
Yes, ma'am.
Why is there a need for feminist theology, Black theology? Why can't we just have one theology?
Yeah, I love that question, Polly. And I think the reason we can't just have one theology is because the one theology we have is sexist, and it's heterosexist, and it's racist. And I'm going to say it's also misogynist and ableist and ageist. And so I think what is required is it'd be great if we could all just get along. But I think the real move here, and I see this all over the place, and I think people say like, hey, I don't understand Black Lives Matter because all lives matter. And the answer is yes, all lives matter. And because systemically Black lives don't matter as much, based on rates of incarceration and poverty and access, we have to emphasize the value of Black lives until they do valued as much as other lives. And I think sometimes labels are really tough. Like, I still remember in the early 1990s, if you were a feminist, Rush Limbaugh called you a feminazi, as if being a feminist meant you hated men. But to be honest, if you believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, you better damn well be a feminist, because it means women's lives matter to Jesus Christ as much as men do. So a feminist is not a misanthropist. A feminist in definition is somebody who says women and men are created in the image and likeness of God, period. That was probably just offensive what I said, but because people don't have that one theology, you have to say, listen, this is a corrective. Oh, well, it's a feminist corrective. I could say, no, it's actually an Orthodox theology corrective, but the people who hold the power over orthodoxy are misogynist. Why are they? Because it benefits them. They may not actually hate women, but hey, treating women equally means that they lose some power and prestige. So it's just easier not to do. I know that's really bold. I don't think all of it is conscious. I think a lot of it's subconscious. But I will tell you, my mother is a teacher. And at the height of her career, when she was a department chair and teaching 6 classes instead of 5, she made $40,000. Why are salaries going up? Because men have decided to enter the teaching field. They decided. And since men have made the decision, they've demanded higher wages because they're men. And that's why nurses now make money, because men are nurses. When men weren't nurses, nurses got paid nothing. And I think that's why we have to make, again, I hate labeling, because actually anything that ends with IST is used to diminish. Consider that. You're an optimist. You're an idealist. You're a racist. So it's a way we diminish, because it's threatening to really think through what equality would look like. That's my own opinion anyway. Kathy, your mic's off, Kathy.
I think the argument was used that only men should be priests was because Jesus was a man. I've heard that.
Yeah.
I don't believe that, of course. I mean, I don't believe that that was sacramental, but there are priests that believe that was sacramental, and therefore it is.
And Kathy, I love that you said that, because I think the real question, even when we say the Nicene Creed, which you won't believe how many people struggle to say the Nicene Creed, the way it's written. The question is, what's important about Jesus? That he was a man or that he was a human being? And I know people who say it's critical to acknowledge his maleness. We all have to make our decision about that. Hey, why is God always called by Father in the Bible if God's not more male? I mean, these are the kinds of things people do. And I think the real question is, how do we view Scripture? Is it a reflection of what we believe? Does Scripture read us, or do we read it? And there's these questioning bits, right? If God created male and female in God's image and likeness, did God only give a little bit to women and more to men? So, well, some people will say, absolutely, that's the story. Adam was made first, and the woman was made out of Adam. In fact, the Apostle Paul says that. What's really interesting is to read a rabbinic commentary of that and say the first human being was androgynous. It was a hermaphrodite. And God couldn't find a partner among the animals, so God just took that first human being and split it in half. That's the oldest interpretation of that passage, not the newest. And we do ourselves a great disservice when we ignore Jewish commentary that is 2,000 years older than our own. But I think, Kathy, we all get to make our own choices, and we often don't realize we're making a choice. We're making a choice whether we're going to carry on currents of tradition or we're going to resist them. But, you know, a lot of people say, okay, who were the first evangelists and who were the first witnesses to the resurrection? Well, they were the women. The men were shut up inside with the doors locked because they were afraid. The women were the ones bold enough to go outside. So there's a lot of arguing you can do, but I think at the end of the day, the question is, what do you fundamentally trust? Do you trust that there are second-class citizens in the kingdom of God? Or do you trust that the family of God is about people taking care of one another? There's that great story about the Garden of Eden where women have to submit to their husbands. So here's this great question. Perfection was when they were equals. So why would we settle for less than that? Oh, well, it's a fallen world. Only because we make it that. I mean, again, that's the original read of the story. We don't have to do that. Sorry, I get a little bit passionate about it. People are waving because we're getting ready to go to church. Let me just see if there's any last comments, and you can always chat them to me. Why do clergy wear black? I used to know the answer, but I don't remember it anymore. It probably has to do with simplicity. And this collar that we're wearing is like 200 years old. You know, the older collar is the Lutheran kind of like bow tie thingy. It's not a bow tie like we now have. It's like a tie. Why do we wear clerical hats? To show we know how to read and write. I mean, all of our clergy dress really came from pagan Greek worship, like the chasuble and the alb. Pagan priests were wearing that, and we just brought it right into the church because it was a cultural symbol that, hey, this person serves in a special capacity. But it definitely has changed throughout. The people who dress most like Pharisees and Sadducees, if you're curious, are Greek Orthodox patriarchs. They wear all black, and they wear that hat that's got the veil coming down, and that seems to have been more likely how rabbis might have dressed. There's no really great theological reason, though. It's just culture, and then we gave a theological justification for it. Thank you all for your time this morning. I know I spoke a mile a minute, and probably with a lot of conviction that wasn't fair, but I am hopeful for our church and where we're going, and grateful for the leadership of our bishop in repairing the gap. Looking forward to see you again soon, and next week, we're going to get to hear from Laura Delgado on 7 cultural differences that are really, really, I think, insightful. And that'll be next week's presentation. See you then, if not sooner.
Bye. Thank you. Bless you. Amen.